Everyone at the luxury ranch laughed at the poor old farmer, until his heartbreaking truth made even the richest men go silent. People said he had no business walking into a place built for millionaires. But when the poor old farmer stepped toward the most expensive stallion on the ranch, no one imagined the secret he carried, the one that would shatter their pride, silence their laughter, and change every soul who witnessed what happened next. The sun had barely lifted above the rolling Montana plains when Thomas Avery stepped through the front gate of Silver Ridge Ranch. Morning frost still clung to the white rails, giving them a soft shimmer, like polished bone under a clean sky. The ranch was quiet in the way expensive places are quiet, not because nature was still, but because everything was controlled, curated, groomed. Even the gravel beneath his worn boots seemed too elegant for a man like him. He paused, adjusting the old hat in his hands, smoothing a wrinkle on the brim, as if a single gesture could make him look less out of place. Inside the property, the world shifted. Luxury SUVs, black, gleaming, immaculate, lined the path toward the main barn. Their chrome reflected the pale sunlight like mirrors that refused to show anything flawed. Nearby, a group of well-dressed visitors waited for a private horse auction, talking in low, confident voices about things Thomas had never owned. Mortgages on second homes, retirement accounts, a dispute they'd settled through a high-profile attorney in Bozeman. Their laughter carried across the yard like a breeze that bypassed him entirely. Thomas kept walking, slow, steady. Each step seemed to announce him, though no one turned to look. His flannel shirt was faded to a grayish red. The elbows had thinned from years of baling hay and repairing fences on his modest farm. His jeans sagged from repeated washings in river water during drought years. The dust from his land had settled deep into the creases of his boots, coloring them more honestly than any polish could. He moved with the careful gait of a man who'd learned long ago not to disturb anything he didn't own. When he stepped inside the main barn, the scent of cedar oil and expensive feed brushed against him. The interior was immaculate. Bright overhead lights, freshly swept aisles, brass nameplates fixed neatly to every stall. The air itself felt rich. Thomas removed his hat out of respect, though no one noticed. Ahead of him, the prized horses shifted in their stalls, their coats shining like poured metal. He walked past them slowly, gaze drifting across the polished halters and leather saddles that cost more than his pickup truck. He didn't envy any of it. He was too old for envy. But there was a sincerity in his eyes, a quiet, almost fragile reverence, as if he were stepping into a cathedral rather than a barn. And at the far end, in stall number 7, he saw the horse that made his breath catch. A black stallion stood there, tall and elegant, its coat catching the overhead light like a ripple of midnight water. Its muscles rose and fell in clean, sculpted lines. Shadow line. The name engraved on the brass plate seemed to hum like a memory. Thomas approached, one careful step after another, as though any sudden movement might break whatever invisible thread was pulling him forward. He reached the stall, rested a hand on the wooden rail, and leaned in just enough to see the horse's eyes. There was something ancient in them, something patient, something unafraid. The horse flicked an ear toward him, but didn't look away. Thomas felt the moment settle on him like warm light, and for a heartbeat he forgot the weight he carried from home, the sleepless nights, the quiet fear that had been living inside his ribs. All he saw was the dream of a woman he loved. He lifted his hand, just the slightest gesture, a question rather than a request. But before his fingers reached the stall, a voice sliced through the air. "Sir, please step back." The words fell sharply, like pebbles hitting glass. Thomas stopped. His hand hovered in the air for a moment before he lowered it. Slowly, he turned. A tall ranch employee stood a few yards behind him, arms crossed, boots spotless, shirt tucked in with the stern precision of someone who believed in hierarchy. His expression held the politeness of customer service, but none of its warmth. "This area is restricted," the employee said, glancing at Thomas's boots, then at his frayed shirt. "These horses aren't for casual browsing." Thomas nodded once. "I didn't mean any harm." Behind the employee, a woman in a spotless cream jacket wrinkled her nose as she walked by. She took a step back from Thomas, murmuring something about the smell of livestock. Another man chuckled under his breath, not even bothering to hide it. Their voices were soft, but not so soft that they couldn't be heard. Thomas lowered his gaze to the ground. For a moment, he looked like a man trying to shrink into himself, trying to become small enough that the world would simply let him be. He wasn't angry. Anger was too young for him now. What he felt was older, deeper, a kind of bruised acceptance. "I'm sorry," he said again, though no one asked him for an apology. The employee sighed. "Sir, this ranch hosts very high-value clients. If you're looking for the public auction, it's held on the lower grounds." His tone softened just barely, as if he realized he'd pushed too hard. "This section is only for buyers pre-qualified by the management. $1-million animals, you understand." Thomas only nodded. He held his hat tighter, the brim pressing against his chest like a shield. He thought of turning around, but something kept his boots planted. Maybe the sight of the black stallion. Maybe the memory tied to it. Maybe the weight of a promise he'd carried so long it had become part of his bones. But the moment had already shifted. The room felt colder. Every polished surface around him reflected a version of himself he wished he hadn't seen. Outdated. Worn. Fragile. "Please go back to the main courtyard," the employee said. "We can't have incidents." The word hung in the air, unpleasant and vague. Thomas whispered, "All right," and turned to leave. As he stepped out of the stall walkway, the chatter of wealthy buyers resumed. Someone called a banker about a life insurance investment. Another man joked about buying a horse just to match his wife's new barn. Their voices washed over him, not cruelly, but indifferently, and somehow that hurt worse. He walked toward the exit, shoulders slightly lifted, as if bracing against a wind no one else could feel. Behind him, Shadowline gave a soft, almost questioning breath, so quiet it barely stirred the air. Thomas paused for just a heartbeat, then forced himself onward. He didn't look back. Not until a voice called after him. "Sir, wait, your hat!" And with that simple sentence, small, almost forgettable, the path of the story began to change. The call reached him just as he stepped into the bright Montana sunlight. "Sir, you dropped your hat!" Thomas turned, his boots sinking slightly into the soft dust of the courtyard. The young man jogging toward him held the old hat carefully, almost reverently, two hands supporting it, as though it were something fragile, instead of something weather-beaten and sun-bleached. Thomas blinked against the light, and against a feeling he couldn't quite name. After the coldness inside the barn, the simple gesture felt unexpectedly warm. Caleb slowed his pace as he approached, catching his breath. His cheeks were flushed from running, and a few strands of hair had come loose from beneath his cap. He extended the hat to Thomas with a shy, apologetic smile. "I figured you'd want this back," he said. "Didn't want it getting stepped on by somebody's fancy boots." Thomas accepted it quietly, brushing the dust off the brim. "Thank you." His voice was low, steady, but something softened along the edges. "It's older than I am, I think." Caleb laughed under his breath, not at him, but with him, as if they shared some small, private joke about the indignities of age and time. Then, noticing the older man's posture, the way his shoulders stayed slightly tightened as if expecting more judgment, Caleb let his smile fade into something gentler. "Sir, you okay? Those folks inside, they weren't right." Thomas shook his head. "People are who they are, and I showed up looking like this." He gestured vaguely to his worn shirt, his dusty boots, the exhaustion in his eyes. Should have expected a reaction. Caleb frowned at that, not angrily, but with a hurt on someone else's behalf. "Doesn't make it fair." The wind traveled softly between them, carrying the faint smell of pine and grain. For a moment, neither spoke. The barn behind them hummed with distant conversations, laughter, measured voices, sharp evaluations of horses and finance, all of them worlds away from the quiet exchange taking place in the courtyard. Caleb looked down, kicking a pebble absently with his boot. "You know, most folks don't walk all the way out here unless they're planning to buy something." He hesitated, almost embarrassed by his own curiosity. "You were looking at Shadowline. Number 7 isn't exactly a casual pick." Thomas didn't answer. Instead, he lifted the hat and held it against his chest. The gesture was small, but it seemed to settle something in him, like a man bracing for a truth he wasn't sure he should speak aloud. Caleb waited. Something in the older man's silence told him not to rush. Finally, Thomas said quietly, "I came to see him. Just to see him." The young man tilted his head. "You know the horse?" "Not exactly." Thomas paused, swallowing the dryness in his throat. "But my wife, she used to ride. Long before life got in the way. She's always carried a picture of a horse just like that. Same line, same look in the eye." His voice dropped. "It was her dream. One of the few we never could quite afford." There was no bitterness in the way he said it, not even regret, just a soft telling of fact, shaped by decades of work, drought, bills, and a life lived without complaint. Something more complex flickered in his expression, though. An ache Caleb could almost feel himself. Caleb shifted, sensing more beneath the surface. "Is she still riding now?" Thomas looked up, and in that single look Caleb felt the wind leave the space between them. There was a heaviness, but also something remarkably tender. "No," he said quietly. "She can't. Not anymore." The young man nodded, the meaning settling into him without need for explanation. He didn't ask the obvious questions, the ones that would reopen wounds. Instead, he drew in a deep breath and offered the kind of simple response a good heart gives. "I'm sorry." Thomas didn't say thank you. He only nodded, a gesture so fragile it felt like the cool edge of evening touching the last warmth of day. Caleb looked back toward the barn, toward the polished floors and expensive saddles. Then he looked again at Thomas, at the lines etched by sun and work, at the hands shaped by decades of holding on even when life asked him to let go. Something stirred in him, not out of pity, but respect. "You know," Caleb began softly, "I don't think it's wrong to want to see something beautiful, especially if it means something to someone you love." Thomas blinked, surprised by the kindness tucked into the words. Most folks don't think that way. Then most folks are wrong, Caleb replied, shrugging as if the statement required no courage at all. The older man gave a faint chuckle, short, almost imperceptible, but it was the first sound of ease that had come from him all morning. He slipped his hat back on, adjusting it with care, settling it over lines carved by years of sun. Caleb cleared his throat. If you ever wanted to see him again, I mean really see him, not just from behind a fence, I could probably help. His voice lowered conspiratorially. I work with the horses before the buyers show up. Early mornings, no crowds. Thomas stared at him for a long moment, unsure whether to believe kindness when it appeared without warning. Eventually he said, "Why would you help me, son?" Caleb lifted a shoulder. Because someone should. The simplicity of the answer seemed to strike Thomas more deeply than any apology could. He didn't respond right away. His gaze drifted behind Caleb toward the open pastures, the hills rising in soft curves against the blue sky, the world so wide it could hold all the things he hadn't said. He finally spoke in a voice barely above the breeze. My wife ain't got much time left. She's been asking to see a horse like Shadowline for years now. I thought maybe if I saw one first, I could tell her about it. Make it real for her somehow. Caleb's breath caught, not in shock, but in recognition. This, he realized, was why the older man had stood so still in front of stall number 7. It hadn't been about him at all. It was about someone waiting at home, someone holding on to a dream with fingers slipping, someone who still hoped. Sir, Caleb said gently, she doesn't need you to describe it. He hesitated, then added with a certainty that didn't match his age. She deserves to see it herself. A quiet settled between them, soft, meaningful, and filled with something unspoken. It felt like the air just before rain, heavy with promise. Thomas swallowed hard. I don't know if she's strong enough to travel this far. Then we'll figure something else out, Caleb replied. Thomas looked at him again, really looked, and saw not a boy, but a young man who had already learned that compassion is worth more than money, more than polished barns, more than any pedigree. Thank you, Thomas murmured, the words steady despite the tremor in them. Caleb nodded, as if promising something neither had dared say aloud. The ranch courtyard buzzed behind them, but for a moment the world felt small, quiet, and carved only for the two of them, an old man who had come for one last chance, and a young man who had decided not to look away. And as they stood there, the wind carried the distant whinny of Shadowline from inside the barn, as if the horse itself sensed the beginning of a journey not yet spoken. The drive from Silver Ridge Ranch to the Avery home should have taken 20 minutes, but the old truck Thomas drove had its own sense of time. The engine rumbled low, steady but tired, like a dog too loyal to quit, even after its legs had grown weak. The windshield held faint scratches that caught the afternoon light, turning it into thin silver lines that drifted across his vision as he steered into the winding county road. Caleb followed behind in his own pickup, keeping a respectful distance, as if understanding that Thomas needed the first stretch of road alone. Needed the silence to gather himself after the morning's wounds. Montana stretched out around them in broad strokes of color. The faded gold of late-season grass, the deep green of scattered pines, the soft blue shadows pooled at the base of every distant ridge. Thomas kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting gently on his hat. as though holding everything inside him in place. The quiet rhythm of the truck had always calmed him in the past, but today it seemed to echo something heavier, each vibration a reminder of how fragile his purpose had become. When he turned onto the long dirt path leading to his property, dust rose behind the tires in slow curls, catching in the cold autumn air. The house came into view, a small wooden structure that had once been bright with fresh paint and laughter, but now leaned a little to the left, surrendering to years of wind and weather. The roof needed repair, the porch railings sagged, and yet the sight of it softened something in Thomas's chest. It was home. Imperfect, weathered, but still standing. He parked beside the lone cottonwood tree that shaded the front yard. Its branches swayed with a sound like distant applause. Caleb pulled in behind him, stepping out with the cautious curiosity of someone entering another person's private memories. He didn't speak. He only looked around, noticing the small details. The wind chime made from old horseshoes, the rusted mailbox with peeling green paint, the narrow path that led to a modest garden where something purple still bloomed despite the cold. Thomas motioned toward the house. "Come on," he said quietly. "She'll want to meet you." They climbed the porch steps, which creaked under their weight. Before Thomas reached the door, a faint voice drifted from inside, soft but urgent. "Tom? Is that you?" He froze for just a second, as if steadying himself. "Yeah, honey, it's me." The door wasn't locked. It never was. He pushed it open gently and stepped inside. Warmth greeted them. Not the warmth of a heater, which barely worked anymore, but the warmth created by a life lived softly. Knitted blankets draped over worn armchairs, framed photographs of rodeo days and county fairs, a small shelf filled with paperback books whose spines had faded from sunlight. The air smelled faintly of chamomile tea and cedar from the old trunk by the wall. Emily Avery sat near the window, wrapped in a pale blue shawl that matched the color her eyes used to be in summer. Now they were dimmer, but no less beautiful. Her hair, once a fiery chestnut, had turned silver, cascading around her shoulders like moonlit threads. She looked up as Thomas entered, her smile forming, slowly, lovingly, the way a sunrise spreads over the horizon. "You were gone longer than I thought," she whispered. Thomas approached her with the careful steps of a man carrying something breakable inside him. He bent and kissed her forehead. Stopped to talk to someone. Emily's gaze shifted to Caleb, who stood quietly near the doorway, unsure if he should enter further. She studied him for a moment, not with suspicion but with gentle curiosity. "Is this your someone?" Thomas nodded. "This is Caleb. Works at the ranch." Caleb removed his hat quickly. "Ma'am," he said, his voice softer than usual. "It's a pleasure to meet you." Emily's smile deepened. "You have kind eyes," she said, and though her voice was fragile, her perception was sharp as ever. "Kind eyes are rare these days." Caleb blushed, unsure how to respond. "I just try to do what's right." Thomas cleared his throat, gesturing toward the small dining table. "Sit down, Caleb. She'll want a proper visit." Caleb obeyed, easing onto the wooden chair as if it might crack beneath him. Emily shifted slightly, adjusting the blanket on her lap. Her fingers trembled, but her expression remained serene. "Tom," she said softly, "did you see it? The horse?" The question floated gently, but it carried a weight that settled over the room. Thomas hesitated. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because saying it out loud meant acknowledging everything she had been waiting for. "I saw him," he whispered. "The black stallion, strong as a mountain shadow." Emily closed her eyes, letting the image wash over her. "Was he beautiful?" "More than beautiful," Thomas replied. "He looked like he belonged to the sky." Caleb listened in silence, his chest tightening as he realized how deeply this meant something to them. How a horse he brushed down every morning could hold the last spark of someone's fading world. Emily opened her eyes again, locking onto her husband's. "I wish I could have seen him with you." "You will," Thomas said, though even he wasn't sure how. "Somehow you will." Emily reached for his hand. Her fingers were cold, thin, but when she held him with the strength of every year they'd spent together. "You've always kept your promises," she murmured. Caleb looked away respectfully, pretending to study the framed pictures on the wall. One photo showed Emily much younger, atop a horse mid-gallop, her hair flying like wildfire in the wind. Another showed her and Thomas at the county fair, grinning under a banner that read "Rodeo Finals." Something inside Caleb shifted. Admiration, sorrow, and the kind of empathy that comes only from seeing what time takes from people. Emily's breath caught slightly, a small hitch she tried to hide. Thomas noticed, his brow tightening. "You need to rest?" "In a moment," she whispered. "Tell me more first. Tell me how he looked." "At you." So Thomas did. He described the way Shadowline breathed like a storm gathering strength, the way his mane shimmered under the barn lights, the calm steadiness in his dark eyes. As he spoke, Emily's gaze softened, her lips parting slightly as if she could feel the breath of that horse against her cheek. Caleb watched her face gently transform, not into youth, but into something lighter, freer. When Thomas finished, Emily leaned back, her voice barely a thread. "Thank you," she whispered. "You made him real." Then she looked at Caleb. "And thank you for bringing my husband home with his hope still intact." Caleb shook his head. "Ma'am, I didn't do anything." "You will," she said, her smile faint but knowing. "You're the kind who does." Thomas squeezed her hand. "You should rest now." Emily nodded slowly, her eyes fluttering shut. She looked peaceful in the quiet light, like someone drifting on a gentle current. Thomas brushed a strand of silver hair from her cheek, before turning to Caleb. "Let's step outside," he murmured. "Give her a moment." They walked onto the porch. The air was cooler now, touched with the first hints of evening. Caleb leaned on the railing, absorbing the silence, the weight of what he had just witnessed. Thomas stood beside him, hands deep in his pockets. "Thank you for coming," Thomas said after a long pause. "You didn't have to." Caleb shook his head. "I think I did." The old man's eyes glistened, not with tears, but with the reflection of the long Montana horizon stretching endlessly before them. "She hasn't asked for much these past years," he murmured. "But that horse, that dream, it's the one thing she held on to." Caleb looked toward the distant hills. "Then we'll find a way to bring it to her." Thomas turned his head slightly. "You think that's possible?" Caleb didn't smile, didn't joke, didn't offer false hope. He simply said, "I'm willing to try, if you are." The wind swept between them, carrying away the lingering cold of the day, as if the land itself approved of the promise forming in the quiet. This moment, this simple joining of two intentions, felt like the first stone laid on a path neither of them had walked before, a path that would lead them farther than either expected. And as the last light of day faded across the Avery porch, Something unspoken but certain settled into place. The next morning broke quietly over the Avery property, the kind of pale autumn dawn that seemed to hesitate before touching anything. Thin light slid across the frost-kissed grass, turning each blade into a sliver of silver. Thomas stepped onto the porch with a mug of weak coffee, letting the cool air settle around him. He hadn't slept much. Emily's breathing had been uneven during the night, shallow, as if her lungs were choosing what moments were worth the effort. He'd lain awake, listening, counting each fragile rise and fall. Now, in the trembling quiet of dawn, the world felt suspended, waiting for something unnamed. Caleb's truck approached slowly along the dirt road. The engine hummed low, respectful of the early hour. Thomas watched him pull up beside the cottonwood tree. The young man climbed out with a cautious wave, as though unsure whether he was intruding. Thomas lifted a hand in return, the gesture soft, but grateful. "You're up early," Thomas said, as Caleb joined him on the porch. "Didn't sleep much," Caleb answered. "Figured you didn't either." Thomas gave a tired chuckle and sipped from his mug. "Sleep's not what it used to be." Caleb leaned on the railing, looking out over the pasture where a few cows grazed lazily. "This place is something," he murmured. "Feels like the kind of land that remembers things." Thomas nodded. "It does. More than I'd like sometimes." They stood in comfortable silence, the kind that exists between two people who have shared something heavy and wordless. Eventually, Thomas motioned toward the door. "She'll be up soon. She'd want to see you." Inside, the house glowed with early light. Dust motes drifted like slow snow in the beams that cut through the curtains. The wooden floor creaked under their weight. On the walls hung framed pieces of Emily's younger years. Ribbons from local rodeos, black and white photos of her riding, trophies small enough to fit in a child's hand. Caleb noticed a pair of leather boots by the door, cracked from age, soles worn almost through. They looked ready to crumble, yet someone had polished them recently. Emily was sitting up in her chair when they entered, wrapped in her blue shawl. Her hair, loose and silver, spilled along her shoulders like threads of moonlight. She smiled at them, though her breath came thin. "Morning, boys," she said softly. Thomas took her hand. "You feeling all right?" She nodded once. "Another day's another blessing." Caleb felt a quiet shift inside him. He'd seen sick people before, neighbors and relatives who faded slowly. But Emily had a different presence, light but grounded, like someone who'd already made peace with the road ahead, but stayed a little longer for the sake of someone she loved. He stepped forward. "Good morning, ma'am." "Caleb," she said warmly, "sit with us a bit." They moved to the small table by the window. The view outside framed the valley below, where the morning sun cast soft shadows across the land. Emily's pale fingers traced the rim of her teacup, though she didn't lift it. "What brings you so early?" she asked Caleb. He hesitated, glancing at Thomas before answering. "I couldn't stop thinking about yesterday, about what you said, about that horse. Shadowline." Emily's eyes lit in a way that startled him, not with youth, but with memory. "He reminds me of Blue Midnight," she whispered. "The horse I watched when I was just a girl." "Your husband told me a little," Caleb said, "about the picture you carry." Emily looked toward the old trunk near the wall. "Go ahead, Tom," she murmured. "Show him." Thomas nodded reluctantly, as though touching something sacred. He crossed the room, lifted the trunk lid with care, and took out a small tin box. Inside were folded papers, a faded ribbon, and a photograph. The photo showed a younger Emily, 19, maybe 20, standing near the fence of a rodeo arena. Behind her, a magnificent black horse reared slightly, its mane flaring like wildfire. The creature had an unmistakable presence. Wild, proud, beautiful. Caleb stared at it longer than he meant to. "That horse," he said quietly. "He looks like Shadowline." Emily nodded. "Same lineage, or so they say. I always wondered if any of his line survived." Thomas placed the tin box back in the trunk and returned to her side. She leaned her head against his arm, resting. "It was the first time I ever felt truly alive," she whispered. "Watching that horse run like he belonged to a world bigger than ours. I remember thinking, maybe one day I'd ride a horse like that. Before all this." She gestured weakly to her frail body. Caleb swallowed. "You will," he murmured, surprising even himself. "One way or another, you will." Emily gave him a smile so gentle it felt like a blessing. "You boys talk so confidently. Makes me feel young again." Thomas chuckled softly and kissed her forehead. "You've made me feel young every day I've known you." Caleb looked away, giving them the dignity of privacy. His gaze drifted over the home, a patchwork of memories stitched together in quiet colors. On the mantel sat a jar of dried lavender. On the windowsill, a row of small painted stones. On the fridge, a list of medications written in Thomas's shaky handwriting. Everywhere he looked, he saw evidence of a life built patiently, lovingly, despite all the harsh years that Montana weathered upon its people. Emily coughed lightly, covering her mouth with a handkerchief. The sound was thin but sharp enough to tighten Thomas's jaw. Caleb pretended not to notice, but the sound settled into him like a warning. When the moment passed, Emily motioned toward the window. "Tom, show him the garden." Caleb followed Thomas outside while Emily rested. The garden sat behind the house, a quilt of colors fighting bravely against the cold. Purple asters, fading marigolds, a stubborn patch of late-season roses. The air smelled of damp soil and pine needles. "She planted all of this," Thomas said, voice low. "Said flowers were her way of carving out a bit of softness in a hard world." Caleb crouched near the rose bushes, brushing a finger along a bloom with edges browned by frost. "She's got a gift." Thomas nodded, his eyes distant. "She used to ride every day. Used to laugh so loud the whole valley could hear. But the accident when she was 24. It took more from her than just the saddle." Caleb waited, letting the silence do the asking. "Doctor said she'd never ride again," Thomas continued. "Her back healed wrong. She lived with pain for years, but she never once complained. She just shifted her dreams onto other things." He looked up at Caleb with a raw honesty few men allow themselves. "But she never stopped loving those horses, and she never stopped wanting to touch one again. Not just any horse, one of that bloodline, that black fire she saw in her youth." Caleb let the weight of the truth settle between them. "Then we'll make sure she does." Thomas gave a soft, incredulous laugh. "Son, that's easier said than done." "Maybe," Caleb replied, "but some things are worth being stubborn about." They stood in the garden for several minutes, watching the light drift lazily across the valley. A hawk circled overhead. Somewhere beyond the hills, cows bellowed low. The world felt unhurried, as though time had decided to spare this place a little longer. Thomas exhaled slowly. "She doesn't have much time. The doctor said weeks, maybe. Some days are good. Others—" He trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish. Caleb stared out toward the horizon. If she saw Shadowline, really saw him, it might give her something to hold on to. Thomas's voice cracked just slightly. That's what scares me. What if it's too much for her? Then we'll go slow, Caleb answered. But I think the bigger risk is doing nothing. Thomas turned his head, eyes damp but steady. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Caleb understood. Behind them, the wooden door creaked open. Emily stood there, wrapped in her shawl, leaning slightly against the frame. "Tom?" she called gently. Thomas hurried to her side, offering his arm. "You should be resting." "I rest plenty," she said with a tired smile. "I just didn't want to be alone." Caleb approached the steps. "Ma'am, we were just talking about your garden." "It's the last bit of color this place has," she murmured. "Every year I wonder if I'll see it bloom again. This year, I wasn't sure." Thomas held her close. "You're still here. That's what matters." Emily looked between the two men, her eyes warm but shadowed. "Promise me something," she whispered. "Promise you'll take care of each other. This world is too hard to walk alone." Caleb nodded first, voice soft. "I promise." Thomas followed, his voice thicker. "We won't let each other fall." Emily pressed her cheek to Thomas's shoulder. "Good," she murmured. "Because something tells me this road ahead isn't one you can walk without help." And for a moment, all three stood together on that porch, the old, the young, and the fading light between them, connected not by blood or obligation, but by a quiet, fierce tenderness that asked for nothing and gave everything. The afternoon sun stretched across the Avery living room in long, gentle ribbons, warming the faded quilt draped over Emily's knees. She sat upright in her chair, a little straighter than usual, as if gathering some last reserve of strength for the story she was about to share. Caleb settled across from her, elbows resting lightly on his knees, his expression attentive in a way only someone raised on hard lessons could muster. Thomas pulled a chair close beside her, keeping one hand loosely over hers, not holding her down, but anchoring her gently to the present. Emily opened her eyes fully, as if summoning not just memory, but the girl she used to be. "I was 17 the first time I rode in a real rodeo," she began, her voice thin yet warmed by nostalgia. "Not one of those backyard events, but the kind with bright lights and crowds that made the air hum." Her lips curved into a small smile. "I wasn't trained, not properly, but I had courage. Too much, maybe." Caleb chuckled softly. "Nothing wrong with courage." "Oh, there is," she replied, with a teasing spark, "especially when you've got more of it than sense." Thomas brushed a thumb over her knuckles. "You had more talent than courage," he said quietly. Everyone knew it. Emily leaned her head back, letting her gaze drift toward the ceiling, as if the old boards above held a mural only she could see. "I remember that night like it's etched into my bones. The arena lights were harsh, buzzing, but they made everything feel magical. Like the world had paused just so a girl like me could take her shot." She paused to catch her breath. Thomas started to speak, but she squeezed his hand once. She wanted to continue on her own. "I was backstage, sweating through my gloves, praying my horse wouldn't sense how scared I was. And then I heard it, this sound, this roar of the crowd. I thought something had gone wrong, but people were cheering for something I couldn't see." Her voice softened into wonder. "It was him, Blue Midnight, the most breathtaking creature I'd ever laid eyes on." She nodded toward the old trunk where the photograph rested, as though the memory still lived inside it. "He was tall, taller than any horse in our county. black like coal soaked in moonlight. And when he ran, she exhaled, shaking her head gently. When he ran, it was like the ground disappeared beneath him. He didn't gallop. He floated. He made you believe in things you'd forgotten. Caleb sat mesmerized, as if transported to the stands of that long-ago rodeo. You sound like you loved him. Emily laughed, quiet as wind over grass. I didn't love him. I worshipped him. Not the way a girl worships a crush, no. The way a human worships freedom. Thomas cleared his throat. She talked about that horse for months. I swear I knew more about him than I knew about myself. Emily shot him a tired smile. You weren't jealous, were you? Of a horse? Thomas shrugged. Maybe a little. Her laughter, thin but real, filled the small room gently, like something delicate being restored for a moment. What happened that night? Caleb asked. Did you get to ride? Emily shook her head. No, I only watched. My horse was steady, but nowhere near his class. Still, I placed third. It was the happiest moment of my life, until the accident. The word lingered, and the room seemed to still around it. Outside the window, a breeze moved through the tall grass, bending it in slow waves. It was the following summer, she continued slowly. Small rodeo, same kind of crowd, smaller prize money. My horse spooked coming out of the gate. Maybe he sensed something. Maybe I wasn't ready. But he bucked, and I landed wrong. Her hand drifted unconsciously toward her lower back. Crushed 2 vertebrae. Doctors told me I'd walk, but never ride again. Not without risking more damage. Caleb swallowed, his expression tightening. He knew people like her. Strong spirits trapped in bodies that refused to cooperate. He knew what it meant to lose the thing that defined you. But you kept the dream, Caleb said softly. She nodded. Because something about that night, watching Blue Midnight, left an imprint. You know how some memories fade like old ink? This one didn't. It stayed sharp. And every year after the accident, whenever pain got worse or money got thin or life got too loud, I'd take out the photograph. Her voice trembled. And I'd remind myself that the world was bigger than my hurt. Thomas gently stroked her hand. She never let me forget it, either. Emily breathed slowly, adjusting the shawl around her shoulders. When Tom and I were young, we promised we'd buy a horse from that lineage someday, save up what we could, even when life tried its best to wear us down. She smiled sadly. We had a jar, labeled it Someday, filled it with change, bills, whatever we had left after the winter feed and the doctor's visits. Caleb's gaze moved toward the mantel, where an old ceramic jar sat, chipped along the rim. Is that it? Thomas answered for her. It was. We used it when she got sick. Every penny. Emily reached for her cup, then let her hand fall. She lacked the strength to lift it. Thomas quickly held it out for her, but she shook her head. Not thirsty. Just remembering. She looked at Caleb again, her voice softer, thinner. You ever love something so much it becomes a piece of who you are? Caleb nodded, his gaze distant for a moment. Yeah, he murmured. I have. She regarded him with warm, knowing eyes. Then you understand. There was a long pause before she spoke again. Shadowline reminds me of him. The shape of the neck, the way his legs move, even the look in his eyes, steady, wild, both at once. When Tom told me he'd seen him, it was like someone opened a window in a room I'd been locked in for years. Her hands trembled again, but her voice steadied. I just want to touch one. Just for a moment. To feel that dream again before. She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Thomas leaned in. Em, don't talk like that. She smiled at him gently. Tom, I'm not afraid. I just want to leave this world carrying something beautiful. Caleb inhaled deeply, his mind turning. Do you think... He stopped, choosing his words. Do you think seeing Shadowline again would bring you peace? Emily looked toward the window where the horizon glowed faint gold. It would bring me home, she whispered. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the truth of her words. When he opened them, they rested on Caleb, searching, pleading without asking. Caleb straightened his shoulders. I'm going to go back to the ranch, he said quietly. Talk to someone. Try to find out more about Shadowline's history. If he really is connected to Blue Midnight, you should know. Emily's breath caught. You'd do that? Yes, ma'am, Caleb said. I'd do a lot more than that. Emily pressed a hand to her heart, as if holding something fragile and new. You have no idea what that means. Thomas stood slowly. Let him go, Em. Let the boy do what he thinks is right. Caleb rose, tipping his hat slightly. I'll be back before sundown. As he stepped outside, the wind swept across the valley, carrying the faint scent of pine and distant rain. He looked back through the window once, seeing Emily leaning her head on Thomas's shoulder, her eyes closed, her face peaceful. There was no anger in him, only urgency, only the echo of a promise unspoken. He got into his truck, the engine rumbling awake, and drove off toward Silver Ridge Ranch, not with the lightness of a casual plan, but with the gravity of a mission. Because now he understood. This wasn't about a horse. It was about letting a dying woman hold her own heart again, even if only for one final moment. Night settled over Montana with a quiet heaviness, pressing gently against the windows of the Avery house, as if the darkness itself were taking its time, waiting for something to happen before it fully claimed the valley. The house, usually dim in the evenings, felt even softer now, lit only by a single lamp on the small table beside Emily's chair. Its warm glow reached the edges of the room, but didn't chase the shadows away. It simply softened them, making the night feel like a companion rather than an intruder. Emily had drifted to sleep shortly after Caleb left. Her breathing was light, like the rise and fall of a bird's wing. Thomas remained beside her, refusing to move even when his legs stiffened. He watched her chest, the slow pattern he'd memorized long before illness entered their life. Some nights she breathed easily. Other nights, each breath seemed carved from stone. Tonight was somewhere in between. Quiet, but fragile. He rested a blanket over her knees, pausing to brush a curl of silver hair from her temple. His thumb lingered longer than necessary. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because he feared the morning. Maybe because moments like this had become as rare as rain in drought season. Or maybe because something in her sleep reminded him of the young rodeo girl who once stood in the center of his world, laughing with her whole body. He stayed there until the clock above the pantry ticked past midnight. Then 1, then 2. Time moved like molasses. The house didn't creak the way old houses normally do. It breathed instead, soft, slow, living in rhythm with the woman resting in the chair. When he finally stood, his joints ached from sitting still so long. He walked through the quiet rooms, careful not to wake her, each step echoing slightly on the wooden floor. He reached the kitchen and poured a glass of water with hands that shook more than he cared to admit. The silence around him made the smallest sounds louder. The clink of the glass. the sigh that escaped his chest. He felt the weight of age settle in his bones in ways he'd ignored for years. He stood by the window, staring out into the night. The land stretched endless and dark, a sea of shadows rolling toward the distant hills. There were no streetlights, no glow from neighboring houses, just his porch lantern and the silvered outline of the cottonwood tree swaying in the wind. Somewhere far off, a coyote howled, a sound that always made him feel as if the world outside his home was bigger, colder, and more ancient than anything he could understand. He whispered, almost to himself, "How am I going to do this, Em? How am I supposed to let you go?" The old refrigerator hummed quietly, offering no answer. Thomas rubbed a hand over his face. He shouldn't crumble. Not now. Not when Emily needed him steady. But grief has a way of settling into the corners of a home long before the moment of loss arrives. It sits at the edge of the bed. It waits by the door. It takes up space in the silence. And tonight, it hovered very close to him. He made his way back to the living room. Emily still slept, her chest rising gently beneath the shawl. He sat on the floor this time, leaning his back against her chair. He closed his eyes and listened to the night for a long time. Outside, tires crunched softly on the dirt road. Not fast, not hurried, just deliberate enough to belong to someone who didn't want to disturb the hour. Thomas stood, confused, and peered through the curtain. Headlights approached slowly, dimmed halfway. Caleb's truck. The young man stepped out quietly, shoulders hunched against the cold. He carried something, papers maybe, or a notebook, tucked under his arm. Thomas stepped outside before Caleb could knock. "What are you doing here this late?" Thomas whispered. Caleb offered an apologetic look. "Couldn't sleep," Thomas huffed softly. "Seems to be going around." Caleb glanced toward the window where he could see Emily's faint silhouette. "How is she?" "Resting," Thomas said. "For now." They stood together on the porch, the night air cool around them. Caleb hesitated, then held out the papers. "I went back to the ranch, spent hours going through old records, trying to find anything I could about Shadowline." He exhaled, fog rising briefly from his breath. "I found something." Thomas took the papers carefully. They were aged, yellowed along the edges, pulled from a filing cabinet older than both of them combined. Caleb pointed to a line on the top page. "That name," he said quietly. "The sire. Midnight's Echo. He wasn't just any stud. He was the son of Blue Midnight." Thomas stared at the words as if they might disappear if he blinked. "This true?" "I double-checked," Caleb said. "It's him. Shadowline is Blue Midnight's great-grandson." For a long moment, the porch felt suspended, like the whole valley held its breath. Thomas pressed a hand to his mouth, overwhelmed by the idea that life had quietly circled back to Emily after all these decades. That something she believed lost had been walking the earth this whole time, waiting to be found. "Does Eleanor know?" Thomas asked quietly. Caleb nodded. "She does now." A pause. "And she didn't tell you this, but her father rode Blue Midnight back in the day. The horse Emily saw? The one that made her fall in love with the whole world? Eleanor's dad owned him." Thomas blinked. "You're kidding." "No," Caleb said. "And when she heard about Emily, heard about the accident, the dreams, everything, she didn't say much. She just told me to keep digging." Thomas stared into the darkness, stunned by how unexpected kindness could arrive from places he least imagined. Caleb continued. "I think Eleanor wants to help." He looked down, voice softening. "Tom, if we're going to make this happen, we need her." Thomas nodded slowly. "I know." The two men stood silently, the weight of possibility settling between them like a living thing. Inside, a faint cough broke through the stillness. Thomas turned immediately. Caleb took a step back. "Go to her," he whispered. "I'll stay out here." Thomas moved quickly, re-entering the house with the urgency of a man who'd learned to fear every sound from the woman he loved. Emily was shifting, adjusting her shawl, trying to sit upright again. Her eyes fluttered open. "Tom?" she murmured. "I'm right here," he said, kneeling beside her. "Just a little noise outside." Emily blinked slowly, her gaze moving to the window where Caleb's silhouette lingered on the porch. "Is he back?" Thomas hesitated. "Yeah, brought some things to show me." Emily reached for his hand. "He's a good one." Thomas squeezed her fingers. "I think so too." Her eyes softened. "Don't let the night get too heavy, Tom." Thomas swallowed. "I'm trying." She leaned her head against the back of the chair, breathing shallow but peaceful. "Come sit with me," she whispered. He sat beside her again, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. She closed her eyes, and for a moment they simply breathed together in the dim glow of the lamp. Outside, Caleb stood under the cottonwood tree, looking up at the stars spread across the black sky. He didn't know how everything would unfold, how they'd get Eleanor involved, how they'd convince the ranch, how they'd handle Emily's frailty. But he knew something had shifted. Something was in motion. Something that didn't belong to chance alone. When he finally returned to his truck, he glanced once more at the house, at the faint silhouette of Thomas holding Emily close. The porch light flickered gently in the wind. Caleb whispered into the night, though no one heard him. "We're running out of time, but I won't let her dream fade." He drove away slowly, leaving Thomas and Emily wrapped in the quiet glow of their long night. A night filled not with despair, but with the fragile promise of a miracle waiting just beyond the horizon. The morning after Caleb's late-night visit came slowly, as if the sun itself hesitated before rising over the wide Montana horizon. Frost clung to the Avery fence rails, glittering with a delicate stubbornness. Thomas barely noticed it. He'd been awake long before dawn, moving quietly, tending to the fire, checking on Emily every few minutes. She slept in fits, drifting in and out of soft murmurs that carried more memory than sense. Each time her breath caught, even slightly, his heart tightened as though bracing for a blow. By the time Caleb's truck appeared on the distant ridge, the old man had already stepped outside, waiting as if the earth were gently pulling him toward whatever came next. Caleb parked and stepped out quickly, the cold air biting at his cheeks. "You ready?" he asked. Thomas nodded, though the gesture felt heavier than a simple answer. "As I'll ever be." They didn't speak on the drive back to Silver Ridge Ranch. The silence between them wasn't tense. It was the kind of quiet that forms when two people know the weight of what they're trying to do and don't want to crack it with careless words. Caleb kept both hands on the wheel, eyes on the road ahead, brow furrowed in determination. Thomas watched the passing fields, remembering the way Emily once talked about them, as if they were old friends she had danced with in her youth. When they reached the ranch, the sun was higher, casting thin shadows through the barns. A few workers moved between stalls, brushing horses and loading feed, but the energy felt subdued, like the ranch itself sensed something different in the air. Caleb led Thomas through the main barn, past the polished saddles and gleaming brass plates. Neither man paid attention to the stares of the mourning staff. They walked with purpose, straight toward the office at the far end of the building, a glass-walled room that overlooked the training arena. Eleanor Pierce stood inside, one hand resting against the window as she observed a young gelding trotting the rail. She didn't turn when they entered. Even in her stillness, she carried a quiet authority. Her hair, streaked with silver, was tied back neatly. Her riding boots were spotless despite the dirt she'd walked through that morning. She looked like a woman carved by decades of expectation and responsibility, but softened by something deeper, something that time had carved into her more gently than it carved the rest of the world. It wasn't until Caleb cleared his throat that she finally spoke. "You're back earlier than I thought," Eleanor said without turning. "I suppose that means you found something worth bothering me before noon." Her tone wasn't harsh. It was matter-of-fact, dry in the way of someone unused to unnecessary conversation. Caleb stepped forward. "Ma'am, this is Thomas Avery, Emily's husband." Eleanor slowly turned her head, studying the older man with the same measured gaze she used on horses. Not judging, just observing. She saw the tiredness beneath his eyes, the lines etched not by age but by worry, the quiet resolve that clung to him like dust on old boots. Thomas removed his hat. "Ma'am," he said softly. "Mr. Avery," Eleanor replied. "I heard a little about you last night." She glanced at Caleb. "My employee has a tendency to poke his nose where he thinks it's useful." Caleb flushed. "With respect, ma'am, this time I think it was." Eleanor motioned them to sit. "Let's hear it then. All of it." Thomas sat carefully, as if worried the chair might collapse under the weight of everything he carried. Caleb stood beside him, recounting again the details he'd uncovered. The lineage of Shadowline, the connection to Blue Midnight, the old rodeo photo, the promise Emily had held for decades. Eleanor listened with her hands folded neatly on the desk, expression unreadable. Only once did she flinch, barely, when Caleb mentioned Emily's injury, the accident that ended her riding career. Eleanor lowered her gaze, as though something in the story reached into her own history. When Caleb finished, silence filled the room like a slow settling dust. Eleanor pressed her fingertips together. "You're asking a great deal," she said finally. "Shadowline is one of the last of his line. He's valuable, not just in money, but in irreplaceability." Thomas nodded, accepting the truth. "I know what he's worth," he said quietly. "I know what I'm worth too. And it isn't much. But my wife," his voice faltered, but he forced it steady. "She won't be here long. She's held on to that dream of touching a horse from that bloodline for nearly 50 years. I can't buy him. I can't offer anything in return. But if there's a way, any way, to let her see him." His words trailed off as if afraid to push further. Eleanor leaned back in her chair. She looked at Thomas for a long moment, seeing not a poor farmer, but a man who loved a woman so fiercely that even hope had become an act of devotion. She inhaled slowly, the kind of breath people take when remembering something that once hurt, but no longer bleeds. "My father rode Blue Midnight," she said, voice softer than before. "He said that horse carried his whole heart and half his future with every stride. He told me Midnight had a spirit you couldn't break, no matter how the world tried. When he died..." She paused, the memory shifting in her eyes. "That horse was the only thing that kept me from drowning in grief. After he passed, Blue Midnight went to a breeder in Wyoming, and eventually his line vanished. Or so I believed." She glanced at the papers Caleb had brought the night before, now spread neatly on her desk. When Shadowline was born, I didn't know he was connected to my father's horse. No one did. Finding these records, she gestured toward the pages. Feels like someone handed me back a piece of my past. Thomas said nothing. He didn't dare interrupt whatever was unfolding. Eleanor stood abruptly, crossing the room in a few purposeful strides. She stopped at a framed photograph on the wall. A young rider on a powerful black horse, eyes bright, posture proud. My father told me once, she said quietly, that horses like Blue Midnight don't just run through the world. They change the way you see it. She turned back to Thomas. So if your wife saw him as you say, as freedom, as hope, then I understand. More than you know. The room seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor exhaled. You can bring her here. Thomas's throat closed. Ma'am, she's not well enough to travel. Eleanor nodded once, already considering alternatives. Then Shadowline will go to her. Thomas's breath stopped short. Are you serious? I don't say things I don't mean, she replied. If she can't come to the horse will come to her. It won't be easy. Shadowline isn't a gentle gelding. He's spirited, sensitive, but he senses intention, and I trust Caleb to handle him. Caleb straightened, shocked. Yes, ma'am. Eleanor stepped closer to Thomas. Her expression softened fully for the first time since they'd entered. Your wife deserves to touch her dream again before she leaves this world. And I owe something to the past, too. Thomas swallowed hard, a sound almost too quiet to hear. Thank you, he whispered. I don't know how to. You don't need to thank me, she interrupted, her voice firm but kind. Just take care of her. The rest is on us. The old man nodded, eyes glistening. He didn't wipe them. Eleanor placed a small, steadying hand on his shoulder. We'll prepare Shadowline today. Tomorrow morning, we bring him to your home. No noise, no attention. Just a horse and a promise. Thomas bowed his head, overcome. Caleb glanced at Eleanor with a look of deep respect, seeing in her not just a wealthy ranch owner, but someone who understood grief and dreams in equal measure. Outside, the wind shifted across the pastures. Horses lifted their heads, sensing the subtle change, something stirring beyond routine. And for the first time in days, hope moved through the Avery story with a strength that felt almost tangible. Morning rolled over Silver Ridge Ranch like a slow exhale, casting long amber stripes across the frost-dusted ground. The barns glowed softly under the early light, their white walls catching the sun like pages waiting to be written on. The cold was sharper than usual, clean, intrusive, the kind that slipped beneath clothing and settled into bone. But neither Caleb nor Eleanor seemed to notice. They were already moving with a shared purpose, each step deliberate, each breath held a little tighter than normal. Shadowline stood in the far stall, head lowered, ears flicking restlessly. He sensed the difference in the air, the tense quiet, the unfamiliar urgency, something between anticipation and disruption. Horses always knew. They knew when storms approached, when fear entered the barn, when someone carried sorrow on their skin. And now, pressed into the morning stillness, Shadowline pawed the ground as if asking a question only he could hear. Caleb approached him with calm, steady movements. Easy, boy, he murmured. We're going for a ride today. Not far, but important. The stallion's breath steamed into the air, warm against the cold, and he lifted his head as Caleb opened the gate. His dark eyes reflected the soft morning sun, deep, alert, unbroken. When Caleb laid a halter over his face, the stallion resisted for only a heartbeat before allowing it, conceding with the grace of something wild that had chosen, just for a moment, not to fight. Behind them, Eleanor supervised the loading preparations with the precision of someone who had spent her life balancing risk with responsibility. She checked the trailer's locks, the padding along the rails, the stability of the floor. She double-checked the halters and ropes, even though Caleb had already done so. Age had not made her meticulous. It had merely sharpened her respect for consequences. "You'll take the lead rope when he's inside," she instructed Caleb. "I'll guide from the front." Caleb nodded. "And remember," Eleanor added quietly, "Shadowline feels the world differently than most horses. Treat him like he understands every thought you're having." Caleb offered a small smile. "Sometimes I think he does." "He does," Eleanor replied simply. Together they led Shadowline toward the trailer. His hooves clopped steadily on the ground, an unhurried rhythm, confident and curious. Workers paused as he passed. Even they seemed to recognize this wasn't a routine transport. One man tipped his hat at Thomas's arrival the day before, the memory now flickering in the crisp air between them. Whispers rose. Nothing mocking this time, only the kind of murmured awe reserved for stories not yet told, but already spreading. The stallion paused at the base of the ramp, nostrils flaring as he scented the cold metal. The wind shifted, brushing strands of his mane across his neck. Caleb felt the tension ripple through the lead rope, the small tremor of hesitation. "It's all right," Caleb whispered. "You're not being taken. You're being brought." Shadowline gave a slow toss of his head before stepping forward into the trailer, one hoof at a time, like a king testing the steadiness of a new bridge. Once inside, he turned and looked outward, gaze steady but searching, as if he were waiting to understand why the morning felt different from all the others. Eleanor closed the trailer door with a soft, final click. "All right," she said, stepping back. "Let's go give someone her dream." The two climbed into the truck, Eleanor behind the wheel, Caleb beside her, the roads stretching ahead like a promise. The engine rumbled awake, vibrating with purpose. As they drove through the ranch gates, Eleanor cast a single glance in the rearview mirror. Shadowline stood quietly in the trailer, silhouetted by soft light, his body swaying gently with the motion of the road. Eleanor's voice was low. "My father used to say some horses carry more than riders. They carry stories, memories, even endings." Caleb turned to her. "You think Shadowline knows?" Her hands tightened slightly on the wheel. "I think he knows enough." The drive to the Avery home took them across open land where the world felt impossibly wide and unbroken. Rolling grasslands stretched toward the mountains, a mosaic of soft earth tones blending into the sky. They passed lonely mailboxes, aging fence posts, and fields left fallow after summer harvest. Every part of Montana seemed to breathe slowly this morning, as if the whole landscape understood the fragility of what was being carried along its roads. When they reached the long dirt path leading to the Avery house, Caleb leaned forward instinctively, scanning the porch. "She's awake," he whispered. Emily sat in her usual chair, wrapped in her blue shawl, her posture slightly stiff, but her face tilted toward the sun, as though trying to memorize the feel of it on her skin. Thomas stood beside her, one hand on the back of her chair, the other shielding his eyes as the truck approached. The trailer came to a gentle stop. Dust settled around them like a soft curtain. Neither Eleanor nor Caleb moved immediately. They sat there for a breath, absorbing the gravity of the moment. Then Eleanor spoke. "Let's bring him out." Thomas walked toward the trailer with Thung, tentative steps, as though approaching a sacred ritual. Emily watched him from the porch, her breathing visibly shallow with anticipation. Her hands trembled in her lap, clutching the edges of her shawl until her knuckles turned white. Caleb unlocked the trailer gate. The door swung open with a slow groan. Inside, Shadowline lifted his head, ears flicking toward the sun, nostrils flaring as the scent of open land and unfamiliar home seeped in. Caleb stepped inside, his voice gentle, guiding. "Come on, boy. Time to meet someone." The stallion stepped down carefully, his weight pressing into the earth with a soft, thunderous grace. His mane stirred in the breeze, black strands catching the light like ink drifting in water. Thomas froze, breath catching. Not because he feared the horse, but because this creature seemed too extraordinary, too impossible to exist in front of his small, weathered home. Shadowline's gaze lifted, drifting toward the porch, toward the thin figure sitting there, toward Emily. Emily's hand rose instinctively to her lips, a silent, involuntary cry caught somewhere between awe and disbelief. Tears welled before she could stop them. Thomas moved behind her, resting both hands on her shoulders. The stallion took one slow step, then another, guided gently by Caleb. Eleanor followed a few paces back, her expression softened by something almost reverent. The world around them fell silent. No breeze, no distant cattle, just the sound of hooves pressing softly into the cold earth. When they reached the porch, Shadowline's massive head lowered, his dark eyes meeting Emily's with a quiet intelligence that unsettled everyone watching. He exhaled, warm breath brushing her cheek like a whisper. Emily lifted her hand. It shook violently, not from fear, but from the sheer force of emotion. Caleb steadied the lead rope lightly but didn't interfere. Then, with a delicacy unimaginable for a creature of his size, Shadowline leaned forward and pressed his forehead gently into her palm. A sob escaped her, not loud, but deep, pulled from a part of her spirit Thomas had feared was already gone. Shadowline held still, eyes soft, as though recognizing something familiar in the frail woman before him. Thomas whispered, his voice breaking, He knows." Emily closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I thought I'd forgotten this feeling," she whispered, "but it was just waiting for me." Caleb looked away to give her privacy, swallowing the tightness in his throat. Eleanor stood motionless, hands clasped before her, witnessing the moment as if standing before a memory of her own. Shadowline remained perfectly still, his breathing slow and steady, as though he had been born for this single act of gentleness. Thomas moved closer, resting his hand on Emily's shoulder, his voice trembling. "You made it, Em. He's right here." She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze with a softness he hadn't seen in years. "Tom, you brought my world back to me." No one spoke for a long while. There was no need. The air itself carried their silence, the kind of silence filled with every word that could never be said fully, every dream one step from fading, every love too large to fit into ordinary life. Eventually, Shadowline shifted, snorting softly before lowering his head again, as though bowing, as though acknowledging her. The sky over the Avery homestead shifted into late afternoon gold, the kind of light that made even the most weathered things look touched by grace. The moment Shadowline bowed his great head to Emily, something in the air changed. Something delicate, something holy. It was as though the entire valley paused, watching a woman and a horse recognize each other across nearly 5 decades of longing. Emily's breathing steadied, deepened, as if her lungs remembered how to hold a full breath again. Her fingertips moved slowly along the horse's muzzle, memorizing the warmth beneath his velvet skin. Thomas knelt beside her, one hand supporting her back as though afraid a strong wind might take her from him. "Tom," she whispered, her voice trembling with awe, "he feels exactly like I dreamed." Thomas had no words. All he could do was nod, because the knot in his throat refused to loosen. Caleb stood a few feet away, holding the lead rope lightly, more a symbolic gesture than a functional one. He wasn't guiding Shadowline anymore. The horse had chosen his own stillness. Eleanor stood beside him, her arms folded, her expression softening with something that resembled reverence. After several quiet minutes, Emily opened her eyes and looked toward the open pasture stretching behind the house. The fields rolled out like a sea of fading autumn colors, golden grass, brown earth, patches of green stubbornly holding on against the coming winter. She touched Thomas's arm with a feather-light gesture. "Help me stand." Thomas blinked. Are you sure?" She smiled. Small, fragile, but determined. "I've been sitting still far too long." Caleb stepped forward. "I can help too, Mrs. Avery." Emily's voice carried a hint of humor, just enough to warm the moment. "Caleb, sweetheart, if the wind blows, you might be the one who needs help, not me." Thomas chuckled. The sound cracked with emotion, and together he and Caleb helped her rise. It took time, every motion slow, deliberate, but she stood, leaning lightly into Thomas's side. Shadowline shifted, lowering his head to her level as though adjusting his posture in respect. "Tom," Emily whispered, eyes glistening, "take me to the field." Thomas froze. "You want to walk out there?" "No," she murmured, her gaze lifting to meet his weary eyes. "I want to ride." The word settled into the air like a fragile glass ornament, beautiful, dangerous, impossible to unhear. Thomas looked at Eleanor instinctively, panic tightening his features. "She can't. She hasn't. Her back." Emily placed a hand over his heart. "Tom, please." It wasn't a demand. It wasn't even a request. It was the soft plea of someone asking for one last page in a book nearly finished. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice gentle yet firm. "We'll go slow. We'll keep her safe. Shadowline is steady today. He knows this is different." Thomas's breath shook. "If something happens..." Emily squeezed his hand. "Then let it happen doing something that made my soul feel alive." Eleanor nodded once. "Let's do it right." Caleb moved quickly, but carefully. He fetched a small mounting block from the barn, something sturdy, stable, safe. Shadowline stood tall beside them, patient as stone. Caleb ran a hand down the stallion's neck, murmuring, "Easy, boy. Easy." Emily took a long breath. "Tom," she said softly, "lift me slowly." Thomas slid one arm behind her shoulders, the other beneath her legs. He lifted her with a gentleness he didn't know he still possessed, his strength touched by tenderness rather than force. Emily wrapped her arms around his neck, leaning her cheek against his shoulder for balance. Caleb and Eleanor steadied Shadowline, guiding his body closer to the mounting block. The stallion didn't move. He didn't flick an ear, didn't shift his weight. He simply waited. When Thomas lowered Emily into the saddle, she inhaled sharply, not in pain, but in disbelief. The leather creaked beneath her. The air filled with the scent of horse and dust and afternoon light. Her fingers curled around the reins, trembling with the memory of youth. "Tom," she whispered, barely audible. "I'm home." Thomas climbed behind her, settling onto the saddle with the caution of a man cradling a miracle. He wrapped one arm around her waist, bracing her gently. "You ready?" he asked. Emily leaned back into him, her voice soft as breath. "More than ready." Caleb stepped aside. So did Eleanor. Thomas lifted the reins just slightly. Shadowline moved. He didn't lurch or startle. He stepped forward with the softness of a creature who understood the fragility of the burden he carried. Each hoof pressed gently into the earth, as if trying not to wake the ground beneath him. Emily's breath hitched, then steadied. Her shoulders relaxed. Her eyes opened to the field stretched out before them. Thomas whispered into her hair. "We'll just go a little ways." "Far enough to feel the wind," Emily murmured. Shadowline picked up a slow, rhythmic walk. The world unfolded around them, the swell of the hills, the goldening sky, the distant hush of pines swaying. Emily closed her eyes, letting the light brush her eyelids. "Tom, I can hear him, the rhythm, the way he moves. It's like blue midnight." Thomas swallowed hard. "I know." Shadowline continued forward, his hooves creating a soft, 4-beat music against the ground. The grass parted around them, the scent of earth and sky blending in a way that felt ancient and new all at once. "Just a little faster," Emily whispered. Thomas hesitated, but Shadowline didn't. As though understanding her heart better than any human could, the stallion lifted into a gentle, floating trot. Smooth, controlled. A dance rather than a stride. Emily lifted her arms slightly, fingers splayed into the wind. A sound left her lips, half laugh, half sob. "Oh, Tom, we're flying." Thomas held her close, resting his cheek against her head, feeling the warmth of her, the life still pulsing through her body. The valley blurred softly around them. Time loosened its grip. Shadowline continued his steady trot until they reached the far edge of the field, where the earth dipped slightly toward a dry creek bed. Thomas gently pulled the reins. "Let's rest a minute," he murmured. Shadowline halted. Emily kept her eyes closed for a long moment, as if memorizing the final echo of movement. "I haven't felt like this since I was 19, she whispered. Thomas kissed the top of her head. "I remember that girl." She smiled faintly. She never really left. They stayed there, horse, man, woman, bathed in golden light, the world around them quiet and tender. It felt as if the valley itself knew not to intrude. After a long, quiet pause, Emily spoke again, her voice gentler than the breeze crossing the field. "Promise me, Tom, that when I'm gone, you won't let the world turn gray." Thomas's grip tightened around her waist. "Don't talk like that." "Promise me," she whispered. His voice broke. "I promise." Shadowline stood perfectly still, the last warm rays of sunlight catching his mane. He looked toward the horizon, ears pricked, as if listening to something far away. Emily opened her eyes, taking in the world she loved one final time. "Take me home," she whispered. And Thomas did. Slowly, gently, through the fading light. Evening settled over the Avery homestead in slow, tender strokes. As if the sky itself understood, it had arrived at a chapter it must turn with care. The light softened into a muted violet, brushing the tops of the cottonwoods, sliding gently across the field where Shadowline had carried Emily only hours before. The world felt hushed, reverent almost, like a church at the moment between him and prayer. Thomas guided Shadowline back toward the house, keeping one arm wrapped securely around Emily's waist. Her body leaned into him in a way that was both natural and unfamiliar. Natural because she had leaned on him for decades, unfamiliar because he could feel how little weight she carried now. Her breath, still slow from the ride, warmed the wool of his shirt as she nestled against him. "I wasn't sure I'd ever feel the earth this way again," she whispered, her voice no more than the brush of wind against dry grass. Thomas pressed a kiss to her thinning hair. "You felt it, Em." "You did." Shadowline stepped with deliberate softness, as if guarding something sacred. Caleb and Eleanor walked ahead, giving the couple space while still watching closely, ready to run back at the slightest sign of trouble. The stallion's hooves made a muted rhythm in the cooling air, each step echoing the fragile, luminous satisfaction that seemed to wrap itself around Emily's shoulders like a shawl. When they reached the porch, Caleb steadied Shadowline while Thomas lifted Emily carefully into his arms. The effort weighed heavily on his muscles, though he refused to show the strain. She placed a hand against his cheek, tracing one of the lines age had carved there. "You're still the strongest man I know," she murmured. Thomas carried her inside and lowered her onto the cushioned rocker near the window, the one where she'd spent so many afternoons watching the world shift colors across the valley. Today, even the chair seemed changed, as though it recognized the significance of holding her after such a miracle. Shadowline stood outside the porch, ears forward, watching through the open doorway. Caleb kept a gentle hold on the lead rope, sensing the horse wasn't ready to leave just yet. Eleanor lingered at the steps, her eyes soft, her posture straight, her hands clasped loosely as though holding some memory of her own father in the presence of this horse. Emily's fingers brushed the blanket across her lap. "Tom," she whispered, "would you open the window?" He hesitated only a moment before pushing it wide. The evening rushed in, clean, cool, carrying the scent of sage and pine and autumn soil. The breeze lifted the curtains, making them flutter like quiet wings. Emily inhaled deeply. "There," she said. "Now the world can come in." Thomas knelt in front of her, one hand resting on her knee. "You tired?" "Yes," she admitted, but not in the sad way. More like, "I've finished something I waited a lifetime to begin." He swallowed hard. "You finished it beautifully." Her smile came slowly, shading her face with a peace he had not seen in years. "I did, didn't I?" Outside, Shadowline lowered his head, nose brushing the porch rail as though trying to reach her one more time. Emily leaned slightly toward the window, her voice soft, but clear. "Thank you, beautiful boy." The stallion blew a gentle breath through his nostrils in answer. Thomas felt his heart quake. Caleb approached the window quietly. "Mrs. Avery," he said. "He doesn't want to leave yet." She nodded. "Let him stay. Just a little longer." The four of them, Emily, Thomas, Caleb, and Eleanor, fell into a quiet that felt deeper than silence. It was the hush that arrives only when people know they are in the presence of something they will carry for the rest of their lives. Emily reached for Thomas's hand. He took it gently, lifting her palm to his lips. "Tom," she whispered, "I want you to tell me the truth." He froze, fingers tightening around hers. About what? When I'm gone, will you be all right? His breath caught. The night pressed closer. I can't answer that, he said, shaking his head. I don't know how to imagine a world without you in it. Her thumb brushed his knuckles with the faintest pressure. Then don't imagine it. Just live it. One sunrise at a time. He lowered his forehead to their entwined hands. Emily, she smiled faintly. Tom, love, everything ends. That's why it matters. He closed his eyes, letting her words settle into him like seeds finding deep earth. From the porch, Shadowline shifted, letting out a soft, low rumble. Caleb's voice came quiet. He's talking to her. Eleanor nodded. Horses understand more than people think. Emily's gaze drifted toward the window, her lashes fluttering as though struggling to remain open. Tom, she breathed. Hold me? He moved into the chair beside her, drawing her gently into his arms. Her head nestled against his chest, her breath warm against his skin. The rhythm of her heart, soft, slowing, echoed faintly against his ribs. I'm not afraid, she whispered. I'm not leaving you. Not really. Every piece of my life with you, it stays. He held her tighter. I love you. And I love you. She paused. I always have. Outside, the first star appeared, small, trembling, alone in the sky. Emily drew a final breath deep into her lungs, letting it out slowly, tenderly, like a sigh of relief. Then her body relaxed completely in his arms. Thomas didn't move. The world didn't either. Even the curtains seemed to still, suspended between breeze and silence. After a long, quiet moment, Caleb stepped into the doorway, his voice nearly breaking. Mr. Avery? Thomas pressed his cheek to Emily's hair. She's gone, he whispered. My girl's gone. Caleb bowed his head. Eleanor placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes deep with understanding. Shadowline lifted his head to the darkening sky. Ears pricked, as if hearing something beyond human reach. Then he released a gentle breath. Not a cry, not a whinny, just a warm exhale that seemed to carry something into the night. A blessing. A farewell, a promise kept. Thomas held Emily for a long time, until the sky darkened fully and the stars multiplied above the valley. When at last he looked up, Eleanor spoke softly. We'll give you space. Shadowline will stay as long as you want. Thomas nodded, unable to form words. Caleb reached out, touching the old man's shoulder with the kindest gesture he knew. You gave her everything she ever dreamed. Thomas closed his eyes. She gave me everything first. The wind moved gently across the fields, brushing the grass as if carrying Emily's final breath across the land she loved. Shadowline stepped closer to the window and bowed his head once more. And under the vast Montana sky, where the wind kept its promises and the earth held every footprint of every dream, Thomas Avery whispered into the quiet. I'll keep my promise too, Em. One sunrise at a time. And the night carried his vow into eternity. If this story touched something in you, I'd truly love to hear your thoughts. Share a simple comment about what moment stayed in your heart. And if you'd like to travel with me through more quiet human stories like this, consider subscribing. There are many more journeys waiting for us.